Good evening, everybody. I'm just gonna get my slides up. So, yeah, I'm honored to be asked back again. And yeah, because even though I had probably the longest I've ever had to talk last time, I think I got carried away with it and still didn't manage to finish saying everything that we meant to. Um, can I share my screen? Yes, I can. Great. Okay. So last time when we spoke, I went through a background to take the jump, and then I went through the climate change science. Can everybody see my slides now? Yep. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to do a little bit of a sort of uh, uh, another quick look at sort of the overall strategy, but from a sort of more detailed theory of change point of view, because that will set us up quite well for going into the sort of three main topics that we wanted to talk about today, which was behavior change science, the social science, and then the measurement and impact plan. So how we track stuff. And as you'll see on the measurement side, I think us and everyone else is still in many ways this is just quite a new well, new is not necessarily the right word, but it's still sort of a developing area around how we measure the impact of changes in mindset, changes in culture. And so that's sort of a developing area that we're sort of really keen to get more support from and find knowledge partners and so on. So, but you'll see, as you know, I'll take you through what that covers or where we are with that. So yes, to take the jump, talk two for um, the science behind stuff. So, in terms of a strategy overview, I think one thing just so this is from our sort of really detailed strategy document, which is like 100 pages long and so on. But just to sort of remind us what taking the jump is, right? And I think that and then this comes into core of when we think about this from a behavior change point of view. Because most people look at this and go, oh, there's 6 shifts. That's 6 things that I have to do. It's very much about practical life implementations in my own, life or place or community. But and it is that it is things that we do with our own lifestyle. But really, I think it's also something much bigger. It's a start of a really transformative journey, inside and outside for us as people, but then as places, and as communities and as countries and as cultures, and as wider society. I think one thing it's really just like, and as we're going to get into through this, like, if you think about shifting societies, and moving societies forward, like has happened many times in the past, if you look at history, really that always starts with with a person somewhere, and with the way that person feels about things, or sees the world and behaves and relates to each other. So I think really this is the as it always has been in the past. Taking the jump is the start of something that is truly transformative for society. And so why is that? We're going to get into. And as we talked about last time, there are three main sort of pillars. I call them pillars. Which is not really the right word for these because they're sort of a leaping process, but pillar is the best word I can come up with at the moment. And the three are unlocking the power of people, growing a joyous movement of people making a change, and changing the paradigm in the system. So unlocking the power of people is all about just trying to get people started, helping people see things a bit differently, think, right, okay, I might try this a bit differently, or get as many people as we can to take the jump. I'm going to go into a bit more detail into these in a minute, but with our theory of change. Then the second is about helping people once they've decided to make a change. Okay, well, I'm going to try something new. I've got the positivity and optimism of a new direction, and something that I'm excited to try. That's number one. So the number two is about we help people keep going with that, right? So people don't lose momentum. That's one of the big fit problems that you often hear with other with similar programs like this. There's a really well-known and incredible behavior change scientist called Stefan Flotsman, who runs MindWorks, which was set up by Greenpeace to figure out. And I think they sort of use this as a kind of joking phrase, but why Greenpeace has failed. Because this is about 10 years ago. They were wondering, well, why is the environment still such a big problem? We've been here 40 years, and he set up this organization called MindWorks. And one of the things he said to me when we were starting to take the jump was there has never been a pledge that didn't make things worse. And this is it, and we'll get into why that is down in the as we go further on, but and we'll unpick that. But that's why you know, we have to be very, this whole thing about momentum, basically, and about setting people, if once people get started and, "Oh, I'm going to do something brilliant," and make a promise to themselves, you've already set your bar at perfection, and then from there, all that's left to do is to slowly fail, right? You know, you can't go up from having decided to do everything straight away, you know. So this is something really important from this growing a joyous movement of people actually making a change, right? And it being joyous, there being somewhere else to go, somewhere, you know, more to bring in and add. And then once you, and also bringing people together into a connected movement. So we're not just all, you know, one thing is lots of people making a really powerful change. There's another thing which is doing that together. There's like an added layer. There's sum is greater than the parts. So that's the other part, number two. And then number three is changing the paradigm and the system. So if number one and two are all about kind of the group of people who are trying this, what about the rest of the world? How do we transform? How do we create this wonderful new window into the future? How do we use that to excite everyone else, right? Those are the three cultures. So I'm going to keep coming back to these three pillars, and I'll probably call them pillars 1, 2, and 3 as we go through. So just good to have these in your mind. And I think I'll stop after each of the 4 sections quickly to answer questions, so we can come back to answer questions about these if you like. Now, recognizing that, you know, why would we do those three? That you know, why are those 3 pillars powerful? Well, because firstly, the science says that by trying the 6 shifts, we can deliver 27% of the change we need. I think everyone on this course is probably familiar with what 6 shifts are. And you know, the reason we're excited about them, or were in the first place, because you know the research was clear. You're really hugely powerful if you adopt them, and we adopt this approach of, you know, it's enough to try, no shaming, jump for joy. So the science says 27% we can deliver through that direct impact in our own lives, but then history says that the remaining 73% people are sort of critical to that as well. They're sort of core to the processes that allow the remaining 73% to happen. And we're going to get more and more into that, certainly in the third section. But this is really recognizing that the systemic changes needed to get the 73%. So the things like looking at our economics, our infrastructure, our technology, the big system level stuff, scale, really transformative changes in that kind of space typically don't happen if the people are skeptical about it. You know, the people need to really be on board, sort of forging the way for governments and industry and so on to be able to make the changes they want. So without a movement like this, without going 1, 2, 3 across those pillars, we won't be able to stop ecological breakdown. And movement like this is a necessary condition. It's not sufficient. We need lots of other people doing other parts of society doing things, but this is a necessary condition for stopping ecological breakdown. Okay. Now I'm going to get, this is going to be the first sort of new, very detailed slide. So I'm going to try and build through this bit by bit, but this is effectively our theory of change, which I'm going to go through now. Which essentially is basically going through those 3 pillars in a lot more detail and seeing how they build things up. So starting off, right, the world today, where are we right now? The research behind Take the Jump really helped sort of frame this very nicely. And scarily by saying we need that massive reduction in the impact of consumption, right? 2/3 in 10 years. There's other, so we've kind of set our goal. That's what we need to do. 2/3 reduction in the impact of everything consumed in rich countries in the next 10 years. That will then allow, by setting that precedent, and well, the 2 reasons. One, because that's where most of the impact is happening, even globally. So we're looking at impact in places like China. A large part of that is to produce things for higher consuming countries. So that's really important from a direct impact point of view, but it's also important because we can hardly go around and say to places like India or other fast industrializing places, you need to reduce your impact if we're not doing it first. So we, you know, those are the 2 reasons why I'm focusing on high income countries. So that's what's wrong, and why change is possible is because you know, 8 out of 10 people want to act ready, but people powers are confused. But it seems that only 13% have really been met by the environment movement. So there's this massive gap and opportunity in terms of where the population, people across society are. So how do we do something about that, right? Well, the first of our pillars, unlocking the power of people, is kind of yeah, it's the from a personal journey point of view, this is where we take action, right? And the two and the activity covers all sorts of areas of, you know, a lot of you will be very familiar with the things in there, but of going out through publicity and partnerships and engagement on the ground, bringing new people into the into activating people and showing them that, you know, this might be something positive they might want to do. So really, you know, using this kind of unique communication approach. And then there are two key outcomes, really. The first is that we activate as many people to try the 6 shifts. Okay. And in that we have two elements, right? We have what we call, and again, this might be a bit more terminology. So if you find me, I know you might not be able to see all of this. I think a number of the slides in this are really, they're from detailed kind of sort of documents. And so I'll be obviously sharing them all afterwards. So, you know, don't feel like you need to read every word. If you can see my cursor, I'll guide you through it. But I think, you know, I'll share it afterwards and you can look in detail. So if we're talking about getting people on board to take the jump, I mean, to try the 6 shifts, sorry, there are two categories in here, which as we get later on are important, and there's a bit more terminology, but we have adopters and participants. And together they make our activation. So adopters are people who are actually taking the jump. Adopters is everyone, people who are trying the 6 shifts, but haven't signed up. So those are many people out there who have heard about it, kind of think it's quite cool, maybe done a bit of reading, and I've gone, oh, cool, I'm going to go and I'm going to try that, but don't bother signing up, which likely is the vast majority. And we keep having stories, you know, of a friend being on a bus in Newcastle, miles away, you know, and then talking to someone, and then, oh, my grandmother's doing that, and oh, what, really? And like, you know, like we're getting constant anecdotal information on these adopters all the time. How we actually measure where they are and what they're doing is very difficult because they haven't signed up. But that's one bucket, and then we've got the participants, which are the people who've actually signed up and who are formally getting stuck into the movement. And then, so that's the first sort of chunk. Those are the activations. And then we have the people we reach. So these are just simply the people who've seen it. Okay, so those are your, you know, and online or something like that. So those are your three categories of change in this first bucket. Okay, so people who've take the jump, people who've seen it and are trying the 6 shifts, and then people who've seen it, trying the 6 shifts, and are signing up and getting involved. So we've got that cohort of people who are taking part in various different ways. Then we want to try and help them get on board and keep going. So really, this bucket now, this is only the activated people who, no, sorry, the participants who make their way into this group. Okie dokie. So this is, and now we're on to the third pillar, which is, okay, if 1 and 2 are really, you're going to hear me say this phrase a lot as well. If you want to change the world, throw a better party. So like showing the world, it's not just good enough to describe what's wrong with the world. You know, if you go to a friend or something and you're like, man, you know, and they're in a bit of a pickle in their life or something, and you just keep telling them why they're doing things wrong, that isn't gonna, you know, that's not enough. You know, you've got to excite people about what's just around the corner, about the world that we're trying to bring into being. Okay, show the great place we're all heading is vital, right? And pillars 1 and 2 basically do that. That is creating in our society these little pockets of how brilliant human life and society could be, and how in balance with nature. So number 3 is about getting everyone else on board with that. Okay, so and this is through all sorts of things like education, cultural engagement, online stuff, and so on. I'll talk more about this in a bit when we go to the measurement side of the stuff. But the outcomes really here are several. To sort of really cement in the telling and of that story. So, you know, this throwing a better party. Imagine if we're throwing a better party, it's someone going around taking the photos and doing the interviews and getting the vibe of it really beautifully captured. And then also being able to talk about that to everyone else outside. So, you know, letting everybody know about the party, telling them where it is, you know, getting it to all the different people in the local community in a way that make them think they really want to join the party. And then also just making sure that that's been done in a way that actually gets people on board and starts to shift wider societies, wider cultures and mindsets, because that's what will, as we'll see in a bit, That's what will unlock changes in our systems. Now, if you think about how these things have impact, so it's true, as I kind of said, that the first two are kind of like talking about showing the way the world could be, but in terms of audience and scaling, so we're going to get more into audience as I go in. What we're really targeting with this first two groups is sort of first movers or pioneers, those who are most likely to act first, okay, and a little bit of what you might call the early majority. So we're going to come more into this, but this is people who are already quite buzzed about environment space, really kind of concerned, want to do something, but don't really have anything that they can obviously do right now. And if we get, but by doing this, this is really practical change in people's lives. This is a direct contribution as 1 and 2 grow. So as more and more people take the jump and try the shifts, and more people are successful at implementing them, you're having a direct impact there, right? You're having people's consumption is going down, and so there's a direct outcome, which is that there are less carbon emissions being and less land use change, less ocean acidification, less biodiversity loss. All of these things are going down, okay, directly. So that's contributing directly to our 27%. Now, then, if you look at the third pillar, this is starting to target in terms of audience the same groups, but also a bigger group. So those that you might call in the the whole of the early majority, and also starting to look at the late majority as well. You'll come more into what that means in a bit. But in driving cultures and so on, and the way that we see things, and starting to reach a bit more of a critical mass and scale, you are able to shift cultures and therefore systems. So the number 3 also contributes to the 73% directly. And that is an indirect but transformative impact. Now, this is quite an important distinction as we'll come into in a bit, but this notion of a direct impact and an indirect impact, they're very different in terms of how you measure them. But in many ways, the indirect impact is the one that in some ways is actually more transformative, even though it's very difficult to measure. So that is what leads us, the 27 and the 73%. You might think, what is that of again? What are these percentages? Well, they're the percent, the proportions of the 2/3 reduction we need. So how we get from the world today to the world we want is through those 3 pillars and that kind of audience scaling, where we've reduced the impact in the way that we need to in rich countries, and human systems are coming back into balance with nature, and we can all live full and joyous lives and balanced lives, which sounds lovely, right? And just so that's the kind of theory of change that is going to be really helpful for when we get to the measurement and stuff like that. Just to acknowledge that, I mean, in terms of, I don't need to go into detail on this, but just acknowledging, if you think about when are we going to do this, how long does it take, how do we reach that scale in time? Well, when we think about this globally, we have 4 actually main phases as we build up to that to what I'm going to talk about in a bit, called the tipping point, the bit which is our target that is going to drive that cultural shift. But so we've got, first is the pilot, which we've done here in the UK, and is almost finished in New Zealand. So this is testing it out, proving it works in the local context. Then the breakthrough is what we're engaged in now, which is, okay, we've got a cohort of people, this works. How do we then get onto the national conversation? How do we break it into really being wide across the country, at least spread out, and across all sorts of different sectors, which typically takes about 3 years, we're thinking. And then you move into what we call the scaling phase, which is like once you've built that sort of that platform on that infrastructure, so that you've got people in most sectors and neighborhoods and so on. Then as climate change starts to get worse and worse and worse, and more people worry, we avoid people going into despair, and we have the infrastructure to be able to capture and offer something for all those people who are worrying about things as it gets worse. And then eventually you build up to the tipping point through that scaling bit, and then you reach the transformative phase, where in a way it has its own momentum after that point. And just to sort of, I think I may have actually shown you this slide last time, so I'm going to be very quick with it. Just looking now at how this rolls out in a different country. So we've got, I mentioned those setup phases, setup, pilot, breakthrough, scaling, and then tipping point. The UK is in the breakthrough, New Zealand's in the pilot. Germany is currently in the setup, and we've got France, the US, and Canada now sort of bubbling away gently in the background. So I think I don't need to go into this in any detail. I'm conscious of what happened last time, and not if you want to know more about this, but this is kind of what Chris gave us some great background on where New Zealand is on this scale and what's going on at the moment. Now, like a key element that I think talk about very quickly normally when I present stuff is just that, okay, so if that's the overall plan, okay, at the high level, how does this fit in with everybody else, right? Because already there's so much going on out there, right? People across all walks of society have been trying for decades now to do something on climate change. And this isn't brand, so we're not operating in a vacuum. How does this fit with everything else? And I think when you look at that landscape, you can sort of see that Take the Jump or something like it, is a kind of filling a vital gap in the ecosystem of change, right? And if you think about that ecosystem of change, and look at the different sectors out there, one really helpful way of thinking about what it takes to shift a society, okay, is to think, right, well, you've got two types of actors out there. You've got momentum builders and you've got direct actors. This is not the only way to think about ecosystems, by the way. It's just one. So you've got momentum builders are those who are creating the support for a change. They're identifying what the problems are. They're building new ways to think about that. They're building strategies, ways to measure the impacts, and they're trying to get the momentum for taking that action established in society. Okay, and that's like your NGOs and your activism. Which obviously is quite active at the moment. Research, so the IPCC, and scientists in the case of the climate issue, the environmental issue, pointing out where we need to go and saying, right, these are the things that need to change and these are the steps we need to take. And then the media doing a very mixed job at the moment, it feels like, on actually getting that information, out to everybody so people can make informed decisions, so people can understand the nature of the situation properly, right? That's what momentum builders are kind of all about. And then on the other side of that, you have direct actors. So those who we would normally think about as the ones who have the powers to implement the change. So national government, so you're setting policy and putting funding out there and so on. Local government, and then industry. And so between these two, if that works properly, you'll get this virtuous cycle and this kind of this engine will kind of spin. The tricky thing is at the moment there is a great big gap in the middle of all of that. And when I give a talk about this, I love doing this. I leave out the explaining what the gap is. And I says, what do you think the gap is? And often people are like, not really. I'm like, it's people, actual normal everyday people, right? I'm not in a way that's at scale represented or active in this ecosystem of actors. Yet you've got around 13% over here in the NGOs and in the activism, but they are necessarily as we talk about on the ambassador training and so on, framing everything in their own language, their own lens, and it's necessarily, I won't say impossible, but it's very difficult for them to get beyond the people who are already on the same page as them. And so that means you're really lacking the momentum being built. And on the direct action side, governments find it very difficult, and industry, to take action when there isn't sufficient support for it. And so we want to fill this gap, and that's what Take the Jump's all about. As a joyous movement of everyday people. So we're working to fill this action gap. And obviously it's not just Take the Jump. There's going to be many movements, many great people and communities all around the world filling this gap. So we're just part of that. So that's really important way of looking at this for when we come to the next bit as well. And then the final, also in terms of this ecosystem, is to acknowledge that we actually something like Take the Jump works. It is not something that's replacing anything that's already out there. We have partnerships with representatives of all these different sectors. We engage, well, apart from national government at the moment, but I think, maybe down the line, once we get a bit bigger, we can do that. But working with these different sectors to sort of to be able to maximize impacts, to help them be able to do what they want to do better, and vice versa. So I think making this idea that Take the Jump's not political in any way ever, never party political. Obviously politics is really important from an environment point of view, but Take the Jump's approach is to not be political at all. which really helps with engaging with the different parts of the ecosystem. And also, this is a tool or a resource that others can use. For instance, activism. We're not trying to replace Extinction Rebellion in the UK here. It's very different. But also, it's a resource that they can use. And just very quickly before I finish this section, I mean, I don't need to go into too much detail on this, but this is something that certainly, this is the sort of slide that you'd probably be careful about showing to a very wide audience, because this is very what we might call in the 13% framing, really. But these are kind of like the inspirational principles for Take the Jump that we kind of sit behind things. And again, when you're thinking about how we get change, behavior change, as we're about to move into the behavior change section, these kind of frame a bit of the thinking around that, right? So I'll mention a couple of them, which is just that. So one of them is that people are actually deep down pretty decent, which is possibly the most revolutionary thing I think you can say in the world at the moment. You know, when everyone does something really terrible or something horrible happens in the news, everyone goes, "Oh, that's just human nature," you know. And it's like, well, actually, no one's, you know, when someone's doing something beautiful, no one goes, "Oh, that's just human," that's human nature as well. Everyone assumes that's a random one-off act of kindness, you know. And actually, if you look at the evidence around this, people tend to behave very cordially and get on very well and organize themselves quite carefully, quite well. If you ask people, get this incredible statistic. If you ask people, what is it again? It's can you trust and the survey of people across all of the world, on average, can you trust other human beings? Right? The answer is 80% no. Okay. But then if you ask people, can you trust everybody you've ever met? The answer is 80% yes. So even though people know that almost everyone they meet is trustworthy, there's this feeling of everyone else outside. So all of their actual evidence of your life shows you that, yes, you can trust people and that people are decent and good. But actually, there's somehow this idea that all the other people I haven't met yet, they must be worse. So there's this kind of, this is something to bear in mind. And I think it's kind of at the core of Take the Jump, really, in a way, is that kind of faith in people and trust in people. And the faith in the fact that that this better future is possible, that what other ones could we do here? People are a vital engine of change, and so on. But I think the one thing I wanted to acknowledge here, right, is this one here, which I think is a great one. The solution is not a progressive dictatorship. So this is something that's really deep, right, which is acknowledging that now as we get into the bit about how we change people, there is a great diversity of worldviews in the world today, and one framing considers them as traditional, modern, and postmodern are the kind of main groups of worldview at the moment, right? And it takes many decades, if not lifetimes, across generations, for there to be large-scale shift across these worldviews. So you might think this is a question that was asked last time, right? Is this thing about the march of the right and things like that? And I know there's been a big backlash against, I don't know if it's the same in New Zealand, but here there's woke bashing is like the media's favorite thing to do, right? Bloody woke, young woke people, listen, telling me we can't do this and that, and so like now there is some I think responsibility is the wrong word, but like sometimes there has been this view in the progressive or postmodern world, parts of society, that we're the ones that are right and everybody else who thinks a bit differently just needs to catch up with us, right? And really what our job is to get everyone else on the same page as us. And which really is, which means quite patronizing and looking down on, which is quite circular, right? Everybody, we want to be completely inclusive as long as you agree with me, right? Yeah, and everyone else can see the hypocrisy of this, and it drives everybody else nuts. And so where you get this kind of so what we're really talking about here is not just getting everybody to agree with us and to think everybody and many of the other things you can see on this slide are very much of that kind of progressive worldview, right? So it's acknowledging the people of traditionalist mindsets and modern mindsets. It's honoring that diversity and working with people and letting them, and championing that while holding this need to better integrate with the environment. So, right. I'm just going to stop there very quickly before getting to behavior change science. Were there any questions about any of that? Nope. Okay. On to the next bit.
Yeah, carry on, Scott. Let's go on to the next one. Yeah.
Okay, right. So now we're talking about behavior change science. So we've talked about the climate science. So the behavior change really comes in pillar 1 and 2. So the first one is basically how we help people take action, how we help people go, okay, I'm going to try this new thing. And then number 2 is like how once they've started that new thing, how they don't just get bored or fall over or get disheartened. And this is not a very beautiful slide, but it summarizes all the different things in many ways that are going on, right? And if you think about on the left, you've got challenges, and on the right, you've got responses. And I think a key part of what looking at all the different work out there, and this is constantly growing, by the way. We're not saying this is exhaustive, but having looked at lots of the different work on this, we've kind of gone through what we think, a lot of the leading barriers to people deciding they want to take action. Okay. Now on here you've got fear. So worrying that you're going to have to be perfect, shame. I'm not going to be able to. I'm not going to be able to. People are going to call me out, call me a hypocrite. Gloom, feeling like this is all sort of too much, and it's going to be going. This doesn't sound like it's much fun. Being confused about what to do, feeling overwhelmed with all the different options that there are. And so there's various different types of overwhelm, but in this case, it's talking about the overwhelm of options and overwhelm of different things that we might be able to choose. Identity, so not being on the eco buckets, not being in that 13%, feeling excluded because of background and so on. The whole catastrophe being too much to cope with, and then powerlessness as well. And so we've basically gone through and developed responses to each of these, and kind of excuse me. So we've got this, there's the little action bar on Zoom, so I keep needing to move it around so I can see my slides. Apologies for that. So those are the kind of the main challenges that have kind of popped up, and this is also from we've looked at the research, but we've also done our own surveys of Take the Jumpers. Or participants, and these are the ones that keep coming up a lot for like making a decision to change. And so in terms of fear, the best thing to do with that is to allow people to remove the fear of the main cause of the fear, which is that they're going to be held to account or be told they're not going to be called out for not being perfect. So that's one of the the foundations. It's enough just to try, so just start. So that's probably, I think, in many ways the most important one for someone who's minded to try this. But the behavior change science is clear that this is one of the biggest barriers to all kinds of change. So that's super important that very quickly we have to nip that in the bud. The feeling of being shamed, obviously we have that in our second foundation, no more us and them. The feeling that this will all be, too much. Well, this won't be any fun, and it's sucking out all the joy. So gloom. So this is the single, as we'll come on to a bit later. This is the single most important one for these the second audience that we're trying to target. So the early adopters or the moderns. This, if you avoid, whose worldview is very much about having a positive life and enjoying, and success and self-esteem and things like that. This one is this is probably one of the main reasons why the environment movement has had such difficulty in getting into those other parts of society, because it's just so glum, so avoiding that, talking about the joy and really focusing on that when we do our activities, trying to find the joy in the 6 shifts and in the changes, and then telling the story of it. Offering the 6 shifts. So this is why clarity in response to confusion. Now, there's often this thought that what you want to do with people is give them lots of options. Now, this is a really key thing with behavior, and often when you have the, what do you call them, apps, like carbon calculation apps, you get all these different things, and you offer, you've got 100 different changes you can make, and your job is to gamify which one you want and to go and play around with it. And there's this kind of view, certainly amongst behavior change delivery organizations, that really is a powerful way to do things. Now, that is for the kind of people who like to make apps, very brainy, very kind of like intellectual. But for most people who are busy, who've got kids to feed and stuff, if you look at the evidence, don't actually like that gamification side of things can be fun in bits, but really it's not enough to. It's not for it's not what's going to make all the difference, right? Most people have got so much going on; they need very simple clarity, right? So this is why the 6 shifts are what they are. They're not 20 shifts. The research behind Take the Jump had many, many, many things that we can do, but we zoned in on 6 so that it accommodates the majority of the change that we can deliver. Not all of it. So there are things that we can do which are not in the 6 shifts, right? But that simplicity, it's simple enough that people can remember it all, and can build towards it. So that's a really important one, and that's that's something that's actually quite distinct about Take the Jump in many ways, and it's a really important part of behavior change sort of evidence that many people just don't seem to get or embody. The language, so on the identity thing, language, we talked about in our ambassador training, avoiding this being overtly progressive. As we're going to get onto, the language is actually very tricky thing with us, because what we need to do with language is we need to have language which is attractive to the kind of people who are on this call, right? People who are going to go out there, people who are really motivated and want to go out and do something. These are the people who are going to help build this movement. But the trouble is the people we need to get on board to reach the scale have a necessarily different view. So we need language that accommodates two big chunks of society, postmoderns and moderns, basically. And so the language is really key. And I think we've really tried to strike the balance of that. Inclusion, so making sure we're going around and all the stuff in the 4th foundation. Going and identifying community groups, community leaders of different communities, and making sure that they're represented properly. Avoiding the doom spirals and being very clear in terms of catastrophe, and then being very, very clear on the impact we can have. Because again, powerlessness, I think, is probably up there with fear as the main barrier to action. People don't feel like my impact can have any meaning, my action can have any meaning. Yes, okay. So I'm just going to very quickly show you, I'm not going to go into detail on it, but how we deliver then these things. So this is a summary of the challenges and responses. So in terms of reaching out broadly, and what each of the pillars, what this pillar looks like, engaging people takes place across, and bringing that message to people is across, press, partnerships, social media, events, community groups and activities, and so on. So reaching out directly to reach people and employing those behavior change measures and stories, making sure that that this is emotionally accessible through the first 3 foundations, and that people actually want to do it. I mean, you would not believe, like, if anything, on the behavior change side of things, like offering something people actually want to do, you wouldn't have thought that was an absolute insight, right? You thought that was obvious. But I think from the point of view of the environment, the environment movement in history, this, we wouldn't have thought, maybe, it's not that obvious. So if anything, this, in terms of this, the first, getting people to change, the first thing you need to do, or the most important thing you need to do from the behavior change science, is offer people something they actually want to do. Okay. So that's by making it emotionally accessible, making it joyous, and showing people the power of the impact they can have. So the 27% and the 73. I'm not going to go into any detail on that. So that's the first pillar. I'm now going to go into, well, maybe I'll just stop there quickly. Were there any questions on that?
Yeah, there's one question in the chat, which is about the Kiwis' propensity to travel by air, right? To visit family overseas and so on, and that sort of if you stop that, that would be sort of a gloomy thing.
Yeah.
So did you so how would you frame that? I know you've maybe you talk to that a bit.
Sure. Well, actually, now, so one of the things that is actually behind this, or one of the big questions you often get asked, right, is if I've got 2 options, right, I let people do what they can, or we ask people to do what they can, or we ask people to do what the science says they need to, right? There's this idea that you have these 2 options, and the environment movement has definitely gone with asking people what they can, well, not always. Certain, so for instance, like Green Friends of the Earth asked people to do like light bulbs and, you know, these incremental changes over here. Um, and then, you know, you've got maybe really sort of more ambitious people asking people to go all the way and stop flying altogether. But really what we're asking people to is a combination of these two, right? So first of all, we're saying that, you know we need to get to one return flight every 3 years eventually, but we don't necessarily have to be there straight away. You know, you can start with doing what's possible. So that's the first thing, is respond to that. So, you know, you can still fly a bit. And if it's the thing that's going to make, you know, if it's going to absolutely make your life unlivable and to not fly as much, then, you know, start with just reducing it bit by bit. And this is in our how-to guide, right? So don't, you know, make yourself completely miserable, because if you try and do that, if you do that, you'll just give up. You know, you'll just stop. So you have to be able to work with yourself a little bit. But then the other side of that is that actually, you know, what a beautiful, you know, people in the UK sort of spend thousands of pounds flying to New Zealand to see how beautiful it is, you know, and it's obviously the place that, you know, it's like Lord of the Rings. I know you probably hear this far too much, but, you know, it's the place that, of all the places in the world, could have been used to film that, you know, to film they picked New Zealand. So, you know, the joy of holidaying locally in terms of seeing local nature, connecting with local culture, there's beauty, you know, there's a wonderful, joyous story to be told around that. So, so I'd say it's a balance of those two things. One, really leaning into the joy, and two, you know, if you have to go a bit, you know, as we get used to this idea, and as society shifts, if you have to do fly a bit, then don't be really hard on yourself.
Yeah. So what we've said on our website is be strategic about it. Think carefully about it, and, you know, do what feels right for you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think at the same time, they're being clear, right? And this is why it's good to, that's why it's great when we have these numbers, right? It's like one way or another, at some point, it does have to get down to once every 3 years. I mean, that's just a scientific fact. But at the same time, just what you said, Chris. So it's holding this balance, which is, I think that, again, that's quite a unique approach, as far as I know. It's because normally we would pick one or the other. Okay. So that was how to help people go, okay, I'm going to step in a new direction. The next one is how we help people to keep going and not lose momentum. And so I'm sorry, I've got another one of these really long slides. I know this is you know, a lot of visual stuff to look at. I mean, a lot of words to look at in a small space, but I'll share this with you afterwards so you can have a look. And again, there is an enormous, I mean, there's just it's a miracle that anyone ever makes a change, right? When you look at the barriers people face, you know, when we do the ambassador training and when we look at the research, there's a vast amount, you know, system barriers, relationship barriers, you know, absolutely loads. And I'm just going to run through a couple of examples from here. And so the first one being, you know, just that range of personal barriers in your own life. So maybe your emotions, your relationships, finding stuff to be too expensive, or, you know, your habit. Well, I think the first thing really to start with on this one is just to acknowledge those challenges, because actually, you know, we as a movement or as a sort of people helping others can't change everything about the world. There are a lot of challenges which are inevitable, and this is why we come back to what we were just saying there, Chris, about, you know, not expecting everyone to be perfect straight away, acknowledging that there are challenges and letting that and hearing people, honoring those challenges, and making sure that people are heard in that is absolutely crucial. Next is sort of burnout. So, you know, how to keep going. You know, people sort of get started, they feel really positive, and then they stop getting any positive feedback after a while. Now, the way that, you know, often is talked about with that is rewards. Now, I don't mean rewards like, you know, if you get some an app and you get your gamification thing. Every time we have a conversation with you know, a strategic funder or someone like that, they're like, why don't you get an app that sends little stars to people when they keep going and they've logged how they've done. And you know, you know, if they've not had meat in 3 weeks, they get a little star that says you're a green champion, which I think, you know, it has been shown to sort of over a short term produce a positive outcome, right? But nothing over the long term. Well, very little, right? It's not for lack of stars on an app that we are not changing, right? You know, it's not the thing that I wake up wishing I had, and then I could just, you know, change my life, you know. So like, When we talk about rewards, we're talking about real rewards that really sort of trigger dopamine in us in a big way, and build benefit in our lives. So that's things like having met other people that are in my life, or having been to an event where I got positive feedback, or having felt like I've been a success or something's changed. I've been able to see that change happening in a movement around me. So um, and this is something we are actually working on at the moment. It's how we can be clearer with people and communicate back to people the positivity of what they're doing, and what other people are doing. So I think, but really a lot of this is, if in many ways the whole of Take the Jump is designed around this, is around giving people these rewards back, to keep the dopamine coming in. Next one, it's feeling like it's a chore, right? So like, and this can, even with the best, presentations around, hey, this is joyous, like after 2 months of doing this, maybe, you don't know many other people taking the jump around. After a while, it can just feel like, oh, God, a bit of a slog, like having to keep an eye on things and keep thinking about it and so on. So I think a key thing about this is just sort of showing people how joyous it can be, reminding people constantly, which is similar to the rewards point, but just really focusing on transmitting, and identifying where people are having a good time and making sure everyone else can hear about that, and can sort of see it to be inspired by it. The next massive one is isolation. Is feeling like making a change on your own is extremely difficult, especially when in a way, we're not on our own. Whether we like it or not, we're part of a world that's trying to make us consume lots. So doing that on your own without anyone else to reinforce you is very difficult. So this is why we have a big focus on bringing people together in places, in organizations, online, in groups, so that we can take the jump together, setting up WhatsApps and buddy groups and so on. This is absolutely critical. And again, this is something that, really surprisingly absent in many behavior change kind of programs. The active creation of communities to support trajectory. The idea is often that we treat people as individuals. Well, there is no me without the people around me. Just checking my time. Oh my gosh, it's already quite late, isn't it? I've done it again. Right, I'm gonna run through. It's a local gap. Right, isolation, lost movement. Okay, I might move on actually from this. I mean, I will share this with you, but there's another one, maybe psychology. So the inner transition side of this. So one of the big challenges is that our inner makeup has got such a strong habit, and we've got a set of worldviews and perceptions and values that make it very difficult to change your world, to adopt the 6 shifts. This change outside is also a change within. So we have an emerging program which we've been working on for ages around the psychological sort of shifts that are required within, and how all of these barriers are met is through what we call the 3 engines of momentum. So this is the second pillar, right? And they're basically about me, we, and then connectivity. So the me being types of tools and support that we can use as just as I am on my own. I don't, I can just use them at home. So that's things like the how-to guides, and so on. And the we, which is things that bringing people together, and into faith groups, schools, civil society, into groups so that they can support each other. And then the connectivity, which is how we bring everyone together across this movement together to be connected. And on that me point, so it's information and guidance, the foundations which help guide us in our approach. So how we, approaching change, as we said in ambassador training, is a key determinant of how it comes out. Inner transition, so I've mentioned that already, the psychology stuff. Keeping track. This is something we're really working on actually, and we'd love, we're going to do more work on soon, and so keep an eye out for helping out with a trial of this, how we help people keep track of their impact, which I'll talk more about in the measurement section. And then nudges, so keeping people reminded. A big one, behavior change science says, this is really powerful to keep reminding people. So that's why we have regular emails that go out, and so on. And then for the we bit, so how we do stuff too. So all of these are things that you can do on your own. There's no need for anyone to involve with anyone else. There's autonomy that I can deploy these 5 in my own life and build momentum myself. And then it's all about connecting collectively, in groups. So local authorities, communities, young people, institutions, and businesses. We have a whole kind of outreach program for each of these, and partnerships with representatives of each of these organizations. The ambassadors are trained to go out and talk to them, and we encourage organic growth across and within these different organizations. And then connecting people globally, we have, online calls and the hub, and we're always looking at better ways of kind of building people into this connected movement, because I think what that does is it allows you to see what's going on internationally and be inspired by that. So that's the behavior science. Now, social science. So this one again gets a bit more technical. This one. I'll share the slides with you afterwards. But the first question really with this big social change bit, right? So we've sort of seen that, yes, okay, we've got this 6 shifts, we've got this way of having, we think we can build a decent group of people who are going to try this. That will have an impact of this 27% through reducing consumption. We've kind of looked at how we help people do that. So what we've looked at is pillars 1 and 2, how we get that, cohort of people who are taking part and making a change. But how do we go on and, I've talked about the fact that there's this 73% and how we influence that. And how do we actually build up from being just a bunch of well-meaning environmentalists, right, in our houses and in our community centres and feeling very good about doing this? How do we get beyond that? How do we build towards big scale and big transition, right? And, if we're talking about the system change, right, how we get system change, culture is a key part of that, is vital. And I think there's often this real feeling that what we need to do is go out there and just demand that we need a new economics, we need degrowth, or we need, a new way of, we need a carbon tax, or we need, whatever it is, some great transition, a universal basic income or something. So great big change to the way that our systems operate. We need our leaders to get with it and just force everyone to do this thing, right? That's just not how the world works, right? If you look at human society, one really helpful way of looking at it is the complexity of that society is to think about these 4 quadrants. So individual at the top, collective at the bottom, interior at the left, exterior at the right. And then that means, you come up with these 4 quadrants. Mindset, which is me, how I view myself and my world, my values, and my beliefs. Behavior, which is, how I actually behave, my body, my health. So the exterior individual, the way I go about things, the skills I've got. And then the culture, which is about how we come together, how we see things together, what our rules are, what our expectations of each other, and then our systems. So the external collective. So really, when people think about change, I mean, my old organization was a massive organization, 500 people all around the world working with mayors to do amazing stuff on climate change. Incredible organization, but all of the entire view of change was in this bottom right corner. And there was never, and I think many people, when they think about change, this is the only concept of what change is, right? And if you do that, if you just try and focus on the bottom right corner, then the inertia of the other 3 make it impossible to change. And so you have to work across all 4 of these simultaneously, right? And so if you think about mindset, well, what we're talking about, this is a phrase, I'm not going to, I think we haven't really talked about this yet, but when we talk about what are the future values and beliefs, what the phrase we're starting to use in Take the Jump is extra consumerist. And I think it's not very snazzy, but like the idea that there is this consumerist worldview that I'm separate from the world, that more stuff will make me happy, right? That is the current worldview, that, that I can take from other people and the planet, and that's fine. And to take that worldview and expand on it, basically. So extra being more than, or beyond. So acknowledging the importance of consumption, but putting it in balance with all the other things that matter in human life. So that's kind of like the goal for us, is so that happens across the board, right? And we've got various ways that we do that I've kind of talked about already. And then in behavior, obviously, that's the 6 shifts. So we want people to try and adopt the 6 shifts. And I think a really important point to remember as well is that if you look at the science, your view of things is driven by your behavior rather than your behavior driven by your view of things. So this idea that I have to convince people and then they change their behavior, it's often actually not that case. So starting with the behavior is actually what a lot of the behavior change science leads us, sort of focuses on. And then culture, extra consumerist collective cultures and social cues. And then if you work on those three, then that will allow the systems to change. Okay. Now, how do we do that? How do we build towards that system change? And what is the point? If when you start looking at this, you think, well, does that mean I need to go in and change everybody in the world, or like, do I just need a certain group, or do I need to get everyone to do a little bit, or like, what is the how on earth do we get what is the kind of metric or the idea of a transition towards that cultural shift, right? And luckily, we don't have to get everyone. There's a well understood principle of and study of this idea of tipping points. And this is quite, I find that this in itself to me is quite there's quite a positive message in this, because what it shows you is that people are very collective and collaborative. I was saying earlier, people are actually quite decent, or at least where our fundamental nature is not competition, right? It's collaboration. And the fact that you have a tipping point is a demonstration of that, because when you get to a certain level of uptake, everybody moves at the same time, because we're all in a sense connected to each other, and we have this desire to collaborate and be in the same. Sometimes that tipping point isn't always in a good direction, but if we were all always in competition, you would have to convince every single person separately. So this is a really powerful idea, right? That for thinking about change. And so that tipping point, there's various different. What is the tipping point for shifting the whole culture? There's various different ones. We've looked at, like, some think it's 3%, 15%, 17%, but the best evidence we can come up with is that we've seen is 25%, which is a quarter of the population, which is 300 million people in rich countries. So that is a really kind of key target for us, basically, if we're going to try and shift those cultures and mindsets and behaviors so that we can get that system changed. So we don't need everybody, we just need a quarter. Now, this is a horrible slide for going into detail, but just thinking, I'll just share it with you afterwards. As I said, this is thinking about, right, if we're trying to get to that quarter, who are we talking about, right? Are we just going to bombard everybody and hope for the best? Or are we going to focus on half of people? Or are we going to focus on just getting that quarter and try and get everyone in that group? Or how does it work, right? Now, we've looked at, there's lots of different analysis out there of different types of different audience value segmentation studies, right? That look at how different groups in society think and what their values are and so on. Now, having looked at a whole bunch, but summarized 4 in this table here, right, you could sort of see that really they group, or we've taken the video, they group into 3 main categories. So climate outreach is a big, amazing study, which everyone, I always tell everyone they should read, which looks at which has identified 7 typologies of people in terms of their relationship with climate change. We think they can be grouped into 3. The Rose's 3 worlds view, so pioneer, prospector, settler. The integral worldview, so modern, postmodern, and traditional. The bell curve over here of innovators, pioneers, early majority, late majority, and laggards, and so on. These can all sort of be lumped into first movers, early majority, and late majority. So the people who are going to get activated first, then the big chunk who may be open to change if we play our cards right, and then the other big chunk who are much less likely to. Okay, there's various things you can say about the way that people view their worldviews, what those different groups get excited about, which you sort of see some of down here, but I'm not going to go into in detail, but we can talk about that at some point if you want. But so how you then build that together into a trajectory. So if we think, well, the first movers, so these are conclusions for how we build this thing up. To get going, we need the first movers, right? There's no point in jumping in at the back end of this curve. You need to go for the people who are gonna get active and start talking about it and get out there and get engaging people, right? So we need the framing that suits this group over here, right? And if we're going to meet that target of 25%, right? These people are really key, but they're not going to be enough to meet the tipping point, right? So if this is the 25% of the whole population, we're trying to make our way up here. Now, we're never going to get all of this of the first movers, that 15%. So we probably need to go, at least half of the way into the early majority, right? And the early majority are those people who are not necessarily super greeny, who really care about things like joy, innovation. They might call them the moderns, the people who tend to be more about practicalities and a bit more skeptical. So we have this challenge now of trying to frame something that fits both these groups, which is what we've, you know, really tried to do with Take the Jump. You know, that's the way the whole thing's framed. But then acknowledging that the late majority over here, the 50%, we're never actually going to target, right? So this is quite a big conscious decision. When it's not like we're not actively, you know, we're careful not to include messaging that directly aggravates the late majority, but we are never actively going to target them. Even when we get to that 300 million people, right? They are never going to be targeted, this group, because this group will only change when the rest of society changes around them. Okay. So by working with the first movers, activating, getting on board, but then effectively training and allowing these people, the first movers, to then be able to represent that, take the jump to the early majority, but in a way which is acceptable to them. That's what the ambassador training is all about. And, you know, and many of you have been through that. Now, this is not always easy because first movers want to talk like first movers. First movers want to be like, yes, but you have to save the world. And if you just, you know, this is the right thing to do, guys. Whereas actually the majority aren't that bothered about, well, they do care about the right thing to do, but it's just not framed like that, right? You know, it's you have to frame it in a different way. This is what we try and get into in ambassador training. And that's where, you know, if you do that right, then all of the three pillars of that this engine of momentum, so the me, people on their own, people in community, and then as a connected movement and online, you know, we can drive that organic growth through those three different, you know, engines. Basically, it can be really powerful drivers of organic growth. This is going into more detail on those different. I'm not going to go into this one, but I'll share it with you. But basically, breaking that down by phase, so breakthrough, scaling, and tipping point. If you've got your first movers, early majority, and late majority, how our different, you know, our participants, our adopters, and our reach build up over time across those different phases, so that we get, you know, to the point where we finally hit the tipping point. Now, I think just one thing to acknowledge with the tipping point, what are we talking about with what is that 25%? It's the it's participants plus those who have been participants and those who are adopters. So anyone who's trying the 6 shifts, there don't have to be people who sign up to take the jump, but anyone who's trying the 6 shifts counts towards the tipping point. Gosh, I'm conscious of time. Now this maybe I will just explain this one because this is really important, this graph. So this is basically pulling it all together in a way, right? Which is kind of acknowledging if you think about what we've just talked about in terms of scaling up, and tipping points and different groups and different pillars, how does this reach the reduction that we need? Okay. So if you imagine before the tipping point, we have got pillars. We've got 2 things going on. We've got the direct impact of people reducing their consumption and the indirect impact of the world around us changing and culture shifting. So pillars 1 and 2 are building slowly in this yellow section, so driving this direct impact. But then outside of that, you've got culture changing, which allows government and industry to do more and other people around to change as well. And then once you hit this tipping point, then that so basically take the jump is active in this period here. And then after that tipping point, the momentum really explodes and takes off on its own. And then you get this, you know, delivery of these 2 sort of types of impact towards a 2/3 reduction. So really, if you wanted to summarize the overall change or impact trajectory, this is it here. And very quickly, measurement plan. 2 very quick. So I mean, what is it called? It's supposed to finish 10 minutes ago. It was, wasn't it?
No, don't worry. We can go on. It's important to get this done.
Okay.
Tom, yeah, take the time you need to do it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, this one we'll share this as well. So even this is just a summary. So the whole measurement plan I could share. People can go to detail, but when we're talking about measuring the impact of all of that I've just been through, okay, so there's 2 main framing things to start with. The first is the big paradox, right? Which is that cultural shift is the most impactful thing you can do, and it's also the hardest thing to measure. So if you're thinking about talking to funders or you're talking to anybody who wants to have an impact, that or see how we're going to transition society, this because people can't measure the impact, it stops people trying, right? So funders don't want to fund it and people don't want to do it because they don't. So what you end up doing is just focusing on the low hanging fruit. So people just want to focus on things like putting in wind turbines or solar panels or something that's a physical, or, you know, something you can do now see a direct impact of really quickly and measure that impact, right? So you can invest some money within 6 months, like here's how much carbon I'm saving or something. So that's something that, you know, and the trouble is with cultural shifts is that they take time. It's take a decade, and they're indirect. So even if I can measure cultural change at the societal level by maybe looking at how many, you know, how often people Google certain different words, right? There are great easy ways you can measure the whole shift of a society. But being able to say, right, I've done this intervention, and then that's the outcome happened, and then I've done this intervention over 10 years, and that's what's the outcomes happened, is very, very difficult, right? And you know, we have to hold our hands up straight away and say that. And actually, we are talking to a lot of well, a number of knowledge partners and universities about how we can get better at this. But the best thing we can do really with this is just demonstrate the interventions we're making when it comes to cultural shift, and have some do our best to try and measure the actual cultural change itself. So well, yeah, so they're indirect, they're hard to measure. I mean, they're long term, and they're sort of hard to measure the direct income impacts. The second sort of key sort of framing of our approach, so that's the first one. The second one is that success means positive momentum, not policing lives. Again, this is, you know, if we think about this, you know, the 27%, are people actually adopting the 6 shifts? Now, the paradox here really is that if you police people, they will walk away, right? You know, I told you about that thing about pledges. The pledge, there was never been a pledge that make things worse. That didn't make things worse. That's because people end up policing themselves, and you end up becoming, you know, you know, you've got thousands of ways to fail, but only one way to succeed, and you've already got the value in yourself for having picked that's you know, success. I've made that commitment, and you've got the positivity from that. So by, you know, asking people constantly, well, how many beef burgers did you have last week, or have you been on a fight recently? It just puts people off, right? And they won't want to do it. So what we really want to measure here is, are people continuing to have a positive experience? Are they still working on the 6 shifts? Am I still trying, basically? And am I having a good time? That's what we try and measure with people. Okay, that's what impact looks like for us. If you have, you know, that, you know, we'd rather have 10,000 people saying that than, you know, and then that they are doing it, they're still having a good time, because then they can be, rather than a million people who fill out a form and say they're doing really well for 2 weeks and then give up. So in terms of impacts across the pillars, there are the key things we measure. We have lots and lots of impacts we measure, but the key ones for each pillar are on the unlocking the power of people. It's participants, adopters, and reach. And I mentioned this at the start. So those who are signed up, those who are trying without signing up, and those who have just seen stuff. On people making a change, we have that momentum. So that's what I just talked about. Are people having a positive, still going? And then a measure of the health of the movement. So this is 2 main factors that come into that. Well, actually, it's quite a lot, but there's 2 main ones. And then on changing the paradigm, you've got 2 things. So as I mentioned, the transformation, the actual transformation in the world is very difficult to measure. So we do our best to do that, but then what we measure as a secondary thing is the engagement. So proving that we're doing lots of stuff, we're reaching lots of people through our engagement in schools, through working with festivals, through going online, through all, you know, through being in the press, all those things that are happening through organic growth and people having conversations and ambassadors and so on. We measure the cultural shift through that. Now, the 2 with stars, so transformation and those adopting, trying without signing up, these are the 2 that are really hard. And that we're, you know, so if you know anyone out there who's an expert in this, or organizations who are really leading the way on that, we're actively seeking partners at the moment to help measure those 2 things. Yeah, and as I said, that, you know, as you saw at the theory of change earlier, these 2 deliver the 27%, and then this one is more towards the 73. Oh gosh, well, this is, I'm not going to explain it in detail, but the you know, basically the theory of change, if you break it down into these chunks, are all the different areas where we're acting. And you know, I've kind of summarized all of these different bits in different parts of the presentation. And each of those letters is one of the main impacts that we measure. And if it's a white one, it's the primary impact. So if we're trying to summarize very simply in a simple story, 3 points, the success that we're making, it's these 3. And to put all of that into a table across the 3 pillars, we've got all these different metrics and so on. And so as I said, you've got the activation, as the main way of demonstrating the pillar one, which is participants plus adopters. So anyone who's trying the shifts, basically. And our breakthrough target, this is examples in the UK. The breakthrough target, so the first 3 years is 200,000 and then 15 million by the 2030s in the UK. And what else is to look at in here? In a sub impact of it's a bit, and then B is participants, but which is those who are actually signing up. So 100,000, and then you can sort of see that the proportion of people who are the total people of the total number who are taking the jump or trying the 6 shifts. Sorry, a bigger number are actually actively taking the jump at the beginning, and then as the movement grows and has bigger reach, of the people who are trying the 6 shifts, a smaller and smaller number will be those who are actually taking the jump actively. So you can see it's about 50% here, and it's a much smaller number over there. The number, the proportion basically. And on diversity, so is another one measure. So the percentage of participants who don't self-identify as eco is a really important one, and we have that at 30% to start with, and then at least 50% by the end. And then we measure all sorts of things else through here. I'm just conscious of time. And then in the second pillar, transformation, is looking at the number that are reporting that positive momentum. So we're trying that our goal is 50%, which is very, very high. So we're not there at the moment, but we're gonna try and build towards that, so that at the end of people's jump period and during, that people are reporting a 50% positive momentum. So that means that they're having fun and they're keeping trying, basically, and that they will continue to do so. Then the next one was local action. So I think if you remember those 3 pillars of the 3 engines of momentum. So the first one is measuring local action and group participation. So there's various metrics that come into that, and then the health of the movement. So how connected is the movement? So how much interaction is there between participants? So those 2 metrics, how much are participants in groups, in places, and how much are they connecting across the movement? Really demonstrate that second impact, that second pillar. And then finally, then get the third pillar, which is looking at the reach and response of cultural engagements. So that's the one that I talked about, the fact that there is the shift in society and in culture, which is this, measuring in some way the direct growth in extra consumerist cultures and mindsets. That how to measure, frankly, we don't know right now, but so that's the TBD. But engagement and outreach, as I said, can be looked at in terms of the activities that we're undertaking. And then basically what we go through here is for each of those metrics, a bit more detail on the metric, and then how they're measured. Broadly with this pillar, most of this is measured at the point of sign up. So people signing up, and we ask people questions there, and that provides us background information on people. And then we try and but as I said, how to measure the people who are taking the shift, who are trying the shifts without taking the jump is much more difficult. And then we've also got targets in here around international growth, around numbers of active ambassadors, and so on. But reach is something that's quite easy to measure. So the amount of people who see the 6 shifts. So that's something that this is one of the main things that we measure at the moment, actually, which is just taking together. We have a I've got a slide for this. This is our data capture system, which allows us to look at and pull all the information online. So the people who are going on our website, the people who are using our hub, who are on social media, and then who we also can bring in the people who are looking at articles that have Take the Jump in and mention. So for instance, if we have an article in The Guardian, we can look at how many people are looking at that and so on. So that's really helpful, and you can pull all that together. We have a dashboard that allows us to look at all that, so we can track our digital sort of footprint, as it were, quite nicely. So that allows us to check our reach, and to some extent, it allows us to check sorry, the second one, third one here. So in pillar 2, the digital movement building side. So that sorry, the connected side. So how much people are actually interacting across the movement. With the question, yeah, with the sort of the amount of momentum that people are having. Are they having a positive experience? That at the moment we only measure through questionnaires, which frankly is not a very good way to do it. You know, we really like to find a more sort of powerful way. One thing we'd love to do is to get some AI bots set up, so you know that people are basically you have a little chat group, and the bot will ask you questions and say how's it going, and you can have a conversation with a bot basically that then through qualitative data analysis you can then track how people are doing much more sort of dynamically. So I think that's something we're working on for figuring out how are people going, are they having a positive experience. And then the vibrant local community side, again, this is just mainly at the moment, we just track this through our team, keeping track of everything that's going on. So we do need a better way of doing that. But, you know, how many schools are we talking to? How many people were there? How many local groups are there? And so on. And I think that probably covers as much as I think I can go into now. That's an hour and 20 minutes. Apologies that took so long. I'm sure most of you have either fallen asleep or gone to get on with something. But thank you.
Thanks, Tom. That's a real masterclass there. I think you've provided so much information and so much food for thought. Yeah, so
that's the first time I've been through all of that. So I think I'm learning as I go, and I think
and to think that it's like 6:30 in the morning when you started, that's quite incredible. So for someone who's a night owl, that's
yeah.
Okay, there's a few questions in the chat, so maybe if we could spend sort of 10 minutes or so going through some of those. There's one very simple question which might be quite difficult to answer, which is how do you measure joy?
Yeah, I think, and this is where we come with we basically just ask at the moment, are you having a joyous time? So I think we rely on people to self-report rather than sort of trying to find some way of making the decision for them about whether they're having joy. You know what I mean? So yeah, I think that's the view. So it's allowing people to self-report whether they are or not is and we'll ask them, on a scale of, not at all, not or in the middle, or yes. We offer that kind of self-reporting.
Okay, and Fred Overmars has asked about sort of what works for him is knowing, say, that if whereas smoking a cigarette takes 10 minutes off your life, an intercontinental return flight takes 13 minutes off the life of someone in the future. But if you talk about it that way with people, you're sort of putting them off, shaming them. So how do you motivate people in a way that doesn't do that?
Well, I think, I mean, there's this kind of view, and if I'd had even more time, we could have got more into the behavior change stuff. But like this view that people are rational beings, right? And that is the defining characteristic of the human being, which is just not true, right? On the evidence, right? It's part of it, but really we're driven by all sorts. Look at New Year's resolutions. Look at the fact that people have all sorts of crazy behaviors that they don't like, that they want to change, and yet can't. So I think a bit of that is knowing your audience. So like some people, that's really helpful, that information. But actually, most people get that. Most people get that climate change is that flying is bad for the environment, and it's the other barriers. If lack of information is the only barrier, then giving people information is really helpful. And for some people, it is the only barrier. Some people are really ready to do it, and they hear one flight every 3 years, and they're like, right, great, I'm so full of momentum. I'm so in, that I can I can just get on and do that. But for most people, the information is not enough. So address the other barriers, basically. Connecting people with other people who'll give them positive reinforcement for doing for flying less. Sell the story of Holiday Local and the joy of that, rather, yeah.
Yeah, sounds good. Sounds good. Joanna, I think you've got your hand up there.
Oh, thank you. Tom, are you able to say anything about these social marketing research that went on to developing the campaign, like focus groups and that sort of thing?
Well, yeah. So we didn't like commission any of our own research or whatever, because I mean, focus groups can be quite expensive and so on. But there is lots that has been done that went into it. So a lot of that, when I talked about the different categories of the four different main resources that we use to look at worldviews and communication approach. So they're all based on a huge amount. So the climate outreach spoke to 10,000 people over time, and did a really sort of detailed study of the way people, many focus groups. So we didn't do it directly, but what we have done is do surveys of our members, our people who've taken part. And that's really gone into feeding into a lot of this. So, for instance, asking people what is the main thing that would help you make a change, like that, which is a tricky one, because actually it's a very bad. People are very bad at knowing what they actually want. So if you ask people, there's a lot of evidence that shows that if you ask people, so with towels in hotels, there's that sign on towels that says, keep it to protect the environment, don't use this towel or whatever it says, yeah. And the reason they have that is because they ask people which of these 10 things is the most compelling, and people pick the environment. But then if you actually look at the research on what works, environment's near the bottom. So people are actually terrible authorities on what makes them do things. And so you have to take that with a pinch of salt, the surveys that we've done. But I think, yeah, anyway.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Tom. Okay. Bruce, you've got a question.
Yeah, but first of all, thank you very, very much, Tom. Purely personally, you've given me what I was desperately looking for in this session, which is what's behind it, and I know that I now understand a bit more of the depth of it. My biggest disappointment is that you didn't spend time on slide 3 right at the end there, but on the other hand, I suspect that's because you haven't got a lot to say about it yet. I think the big question for me is I'm sitting with a group of people who sort of sit on some skepticism about how we make behavioral and social change, and skepticism in the sense that they've been trying. And it's my problem is I want to confront them with your stuff. the things like the barriers to change. I'm an info guy, okay? Things like the barriers to change, which just spoke so deeply to me. Am I going to be able to pull off persuading people by taking them through this stuff? People who are in that first 13% without a doubt, or am I going to turn them off?
Well, that's a good point. So if they're in the 13%, potentially, if they're in the 13%, potentially, I think, I mean, certainly if someone's going to sit through this, they're already persuaded, right? So it's a bit, you can't use this to persuade. This is that, it's like the show don't tell thing, isn't it? But I mean, I suppose it's a good point. We could do with developing a very snappy way of being of articulating the possibility of this to people who are in the 13%, who've kind of because I think a lot of people, and I had that slide where I talked about the basic principles. People are actually decent, right? Many people in the 13%, the hope has killed them, right? The hope of change, and now they're like, people are terrible. It's all going to come. We're all going to die out, and then the earth will give a new species, right? That'll sort of. That's a really common view, and to help people out of that, I think is something really powerful. So that's a good point. Maybe we should try and think of that.
I think Anne may have phrased it even better than me. Well, even better than me. Have you written up this behavior change masterclass? And I think a lot of us believe like me. It's not that people are terrible. It's just that the juggernaut's moving so fast. I think that's the scary thing. but have you written up this behavior change masterclass? I desperately want to get my people together for 4 hours, and just walk through and talk about this stuff and get them to see there is a way forward. But I need help with that. I'll shut up now.
Sure. Well, let's do it. Let's do it. And just so yeah, thanks, Bruce. And just yeah, I didn't go into too much detail on that slide 3, partly because I was just conscious of time, but I mean, it's well, I'll share it with you. And we do basically really what we have at the moment is ways of measuring, just to give you a bit more information on it, guide, we can't measure the outcome really, but we can measure the interventions. So we have for each of the sort of 10 or so ways that we try and drive culture change. For instance, education. We track what's going on in there. So how many schools we're going into, and we do, we try and get surveys of the kids, or at least the teachers afterwards, and all that sort of stuff. So you can get a proxy. But yeah.
Great. All right. I've got a question that Heather sent me, which is around sort of groups and like, so groups can be great for offering support, encouragement, and so on, but also could be sort of a bit of negative in the sense of shaming. If someone does take a flight or something, then maybe there's a propensity to go out within the group, so there's sort of positive and maybe potentially negative tensions there.
Yeah, that's a risk. I think it's a risk. I think it's and that's why we really lean into that second foundation to avoid that risk, and make sure it's supportive. Yeah, certainly in the Twitter age.
Yes,
nice
Twitter.
People.
But Joanna, another question.
Oh, thank you, Chris. Tom, this is a serious campaign, and you are looking to get thousands, if not tens of thousands, and ultimately more people responding. At some point, this is going to mean that the lowered consumption will have systemic economic effects on particular industries: meat industry, dairy industry, fashion industry, appliance industry, etc. Has any of that pushback been felt, or expected pushback been felt yet in the UK? And have you thought about how eventually you might deal with serious pushback from industries that are in fact suffering from lowered consumption?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a good question. And like, my background, well, my first 10 years was in the private sector. So it's sort of, and I think that the first thing to acknowledge, right, is that we're not that businesses, how to put it, like, that certainly in kind of environmental circles, there can be this such idea that business is bad, right? That there's this that we want less business somehow. And that's certainly not, I think, the reality of this. Like, this is a massive opportunity for business on the whole, going forward. There's so many opportunities across the 6 shifts to be prosperous. So if you're thinking about going into the future on textiles, yes, the textile industry is going to have to change a lot, which isn't going to be very easy always. But as we move from, and many textile companies recognize this, H&M, a few years ago, I was talking to them about, they recognize that this idea of taking cotton, turning it into items, and then chucking them out to people is not that linear cycle is not going to be able to be here in 30 years. There's going to have to be a different cycle. H&M is aware that they're going to be a provision, they're going to provide clothing, being clothed rather than clothing. So clothing as a service rather than clothing as a product. So you spend some money a year, every year, and then you can have up to 10 items and then, they're incentivized to make those items then really, really tough and good quality so that they can last as long as possible. And you're incentivized not to wreck them or to, and you only have the ones you need. And then, you can maybe, you don't end up having a whole wardrobe, that, some items you only use once a year. You can actually, we sort of share those resources. So that's an example, of how there's massive opportunity for business here. And like, when everyone's taken the 6 shifts completely, there will still be loads of thriving businesses, right? No, so that's a general point about this not being about, you know, it's not necessarily damaging to business on the whole, but obviously there are certain sort of practices within different sectors that will be moved away from. So like meat farming, yeah, for sure that's going to have to come down. And I think, but I think the focus on that is just talking about, it's not farming in general. We still know food, we still need food. There just needs to be support for, you know, the phrase that's everywhere in the environment, you know, space is the just transition, you know. So once we start to reach a scale where we're shifting cultures significantly, that enables governments to start taking more bold action on this. And one of the key things the government needs to do, so for instance, if you look at, you know, moving out in the energy sector, moving from fossil fuels to renewables, there needs to be the support to reskill people who can move from that industry to the next. So it's not that there's going to be less business. It's just how we get from here to there without there being too much fallout and without people being, you know, losing their jobs and so on. And that's all about how we manage that transition to society, which really is the government's job. But when that, you know, that will be more likely the more people we get to do this cultural shift. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Yeah, great. Okay, I think we'll call it a day or call it an evening with that. Yeah, you've done a fantastic job there, Tom. At a very early hour of the morning for you. So we really appreciate that very much. And obviously we'll keep in contact with you, right? So we are, I think Tom and I are going to have a little chat after this. And one of the items on the agenda is about planning for the next round of ambassador training next year. So we'll hopefully settle on sometime around February into March next year for doing that. So there'll be another opportunity to have more conversations with Tom and other people from the UK team.